Why does the city of Rockingham hate our history so much and try to push it aside into a far corner of people's minds and into a corner of their own purview of responsibilities as the receivers and administrators of the municipality of the district of Rockingham? It is because that is the agenda of these foreign administrators, which I exposed in the first video, that your councils, state governments and Commonwealth governments are not what they purport to be and are one in the same. They are all receivers and administrators, but they go far beyond their purview of this type of administrator. They are supposed to recover the debt that is owed to them by receiving the income of the debtor and then leave. Instead, they arrived in secret amidst people's ignorance and apathy and stayed and have never left. And people question their motives and extortionate activities so much that it has its own colloquial term now, being the nanny state. Someone recently asked me, why don't I drive my cars anymore? My reply being, because I will not pay annual vehicle registration, to which they asked, why not? And I asked them, why would you pay upwards of $1,000 to re-register your car year after year? And the answer was a shrug of their shoulders. This is what people need to stop doing, is shrugging their shoulders. Is the penny starting to drop yet that these so-called councils and governments are run by foreign influence, and they do nanny you, as you are just deemed to be children and wards of the state, living in your council wards? Because none of you have worked out that they snuck in and took over your country right in front of your eyes over decades. And they engage in such social engineering as hiding our own history, allowing an incomplete and distorted version of history to become the norm, which has been taught by corrupted educators for decades, so that now it has become true and self-evident in generations of Australians. And they promote the history and culture of other countries over that of our own, and they glorify treason against the Imperial Crown and the Commonwealth of Australia, which the city of Rockingham does every year. So much so that these people mock people like us who discovered why something did not seem right with the government overreach that everyone complains about but does nothing. And they ridicule and even threaten with violence for talking about the true history that conflicts with the version now cemented into their minds in a delusion. An example of such is the fact and the reality of what design and colour flags were flown by the people and that flown by the government and on government buildings for over the first half of the last century. Government was blue, people's merchant flag was red. Simple as that. This causes such conflict in people's mind, which can express itself in anger and ridicule towards those who will speak of anything different to what they have been taught, and it now sits in their mind as truth and fact, which it is not. There is proof of how and why history has been and is continued to be distorted and taught to our children from a young age at these schools, and thus their knowledge of history is corrupted. And that proof is the declaration regarding the teaching of history, in brackets, revision of school textbooks, open for signatures at Geneva, 2nd of October 1937, signed by and came into force for Australia on the 24th of June 1939. Yes, it is exactly as bad as it sounds. Revising history is changing the version of history, and the history of other cultures is taught and has been happening since 1939. This is why nobody in Australia knows that Australia is its own realm and kingdom. And just think how many books were burnt or buried by the Australian government. Just take the King's English Dictionary as an example. There should be so many of these old copies still available in second-hand bookstores and garage sales, but there is not. The last discovery of a King's English Dictionary that I heard of that didn't have an exorbitant price tag was a copy found in an old rubbish tip. And with a mayor that has a degree in history and worked in a library for many years, it makes this even more disappointing and disgraceful. Who does the mayor really serve, and which version of history does the mayor support? As a so-called passionate advocate for education, the real version or the version that's been incorrectly taught for 85 years now? So this brings me to the catalyst for this video and why it has been made before the subject promised at the end of the first video. And that catalyst is razor wire. Welcome to the city of Rockingham. Slap-happy users of razor wire, purveyors of fake history, promoters of every other culture except yours, and the controllers and jailers of local history and culture of the same. Not exactly a kind of slogan that's attractive or appealing to be on a website or an advertising campaign, but this is exactly the type of activities that the city of Rockingham engages in. I would like to point out that two remaining historical buildings in our district's heritage, one being the semi-restored Chesterfield Inn and the other Dixon's Abattoir, are locked up between an 8-foot chain-link fence with 3 lines of barbed wire, a 9-foot high palisade wall of spiked metal stakes, and the absolutely and unnecessary and disgraceful use of razor wire. So for anyone who might visit, especially children, what are they to think when they see these buildings completely surrounded in hundreds of metres of razor wire, usually reserved for maximum security prisons to incarcerate dangerous criminals, or in war zones in faraway lands? We will concede and be fair and truthful here and state that both buildings in the past have fallen victim to arson, vandalism and thievery, but completely due to the isolated vicinity of Chesterfield Inn's location and the somewhat isolated location of Dixon's Abattoir. However, these locations, isolation, in particular Chesterfield, are also the result of the deliberate actions of these criminal administrators of the state government and the council in receivership. As to the zoning of these locations and how they've zoned this land to be of a general industrial nature, to hope to bury the past, that this area of land around Old Mandurah Road and Chesterfield Inn was Rockingham, not East Rockingham. It's where the settlers and pioneers of the district began, before a railway was built to a port on the coastline. It is where all the men who formed a council of men that formed the Rockingham Road Board's district lived, all along Mandurah Road, and the Chesterfield was ground zero for the fledgling district, and they all formed said board under lawful provisions of an imperial act, being the Road Boards Act 1888, in the 52nd year of our most gracious Queen Victoria's reign, and the 16th Act of that year. This Act, and the subsequent Act passed in 1919 by her grandson, the much beloved George V. This is the true law, which these impostors of today purport to draw their power and authority from. Instead of these 2 metal fence barriers and hundreds of metres of razor wire around these historical buildings, did anyone think of spending that money on lighting around the buildings? Or perhaps, for the first time in over 50 years, would the city of Rockingham actually do something to advocate for the district and the people of the district? Chesterfield House has a rich history, and to see it languishing in an isolated and industrial zoned area is a disgrace to all those who came before. Sir John Forrest himself was a regular guest and had his honeymoon there. He was the first Premier of Western Australia and a surveyor, an explorer, the first Postmaster General of the Commonwealth, the second Defence Minister of the Commonwealth, and the Treasurer of the Commonwealth 4 times, and was to be admitted into the peerage as the first Australian-born Baron. The famous 10th Light Horse Regiment regularly camped on the same parcel of land, and they spent their last night in Australia before shipping out to Egypt and World War I, with many never to return. Chesterfield Inn could have been the centre of a true and dignified heritage precinct, with itself being once again a bush tavern, an inn or bed and breakfast, with a permanent camping ground where the 10th Light Horse camped. Day Cottage, otherwise known as Allendale, could have been an equine-orientated bed and breakfast or youth horse riding camp, or something of the sort. And likewise for Hymas House, Woodbine Cottage and Meads Homesteads, all could have been a magnificent, practical and meaningful tribute to our past. Instead, we have this hodgepodge shit heap of semi-stagnant commercial and industrial developments spaced over the last 33 years, where the paddocks alongside Old Mandurah Road have slowly disappeared, with the homesteads merging into obscurity in private commercial ownership, and vacant land prone to cars being set alight and rubbish being dumped. This is your fake council at work, people, burying our history whilst promoting and glorifying treasonous events such as the Catalpa escape, which can have its own video coming up soon, before this ridiculous Catalpa treason festival coming up. So everyone, get interested and annoyed that they hide and lock up your local history behind razor wire, and they taught you and your kids a distorted version of history, and they host public events that glorify treason to the crown and promote the Roman Catholic cultures of other countries before our own. And the mayor has failed as a historian, a librarian, a councillor and a mayor. Who do you serve, mayor?